All right, so we are going to continue first talking about how we know that species have evolved. We were talking yesterday about some of the evidence. And we got through a few pieces like examining the DNA of different species, looking at the fossil record, seeing those similarities in bone structure and where species are found. Just one additional piece of evidence to add is these structures. So I used to take my daughters every year to this museum in Ithaca called the Museum of the Earth. Anyone ever been there? Okay, so hanging from the ceiling there, just Max has been there, anyone else? Pretty neat museum, I don't know. Did you like it, Max?
Yeah.
You're into science and stuff. So hanging in the main entry there, they have a huge whale skeleton. Okay? And then, so it looks like you would expect a whale skeleton looks like, but then like hanging near the back, and if you've ever seen a mounted whale skeleton, you may have noticed this, there's like two bones sort of hanging there and just kind of floating. They're not attached to any of the other bones of the whale skeleton, and so it kind of looks weird. Okay? There are these bones right here. They're not connected to the spinal cord or really anything else. Does anyone have any idea what those bones are?
Cartilage.
No, they're actual bone.
Extra bone in case you're running out of other ones.
No, they are sort of kind of in a way extra bone. What they are they are sort of the leftovers of evolution, the remnants of their ancient ancestors. Because, does anyone know what type of animal are whales? Mammals. They evolved from, does anyone know what type of mammal whales evolved from? What's that?
A water dinosaur.
No, they're mammals. They evolved from other mammals.
A platypus?
No, but they evolved from what? What's that? Not quite.
Dolphins.
No. So they evolved from sort of an ancestor that probably looked something like a wolf.
I was right.
And they evolved from four-legged mammals. Over time, they evolved for their limbs to be reduced, and they changed from typical limbs into flippers. And their rear limbs were basically reduced over time because it was useful. The smaller and smaller hind limbs made them more able to swim through the water easier, so they evolved to be smaller and smaller until eventually they were gone. And so these bones are sort of the remains of the pelvis of the hind limbs which whales evolved from. So those are called vestigial structures, kind of leftovers from evolution that you can sort of see in them the history of that type of organism. You can find something very similar, okay, in snakes. If you look, snakes, they obviously have no limbs. Okay? They have no arms or legs. But if you look at the very, in the back portion of the snake skeleton, there is the remains of a pelvis and sort of modified or very small sort of leg bones. Now they're not used anymore, they're not needed, they don't serve any real function, but they're there because snakes evolved from four-legged lizards. And so they're just kind of still there, and they can tell us a little bit about the evolution of these snakes. Okay? Or if you imagine the tailbone of humans, okay? Our tailbone is sort of the remnant of the tail that humans have when we shared a common ancestor with monkeys. Sage?
Will these bones ever disappear?
So they will only disappear really if they're having some negative effect on the survival of that organism. So when they were actual legs, they were sort of probably hindering the ability of the whale to swim through the water. So therefore, natural selection, which we'll be talking about, would favor smaller and smaller limbs. And so they became smaller and smaller. But once they were gone, there's not really any benefit to them sort of disappearing. So probably they'll stay around. All right, so let's talk about natural selection. So we talked about artificial selection. When humans choose which individuals survive and reproduce in order so humans can sort of guide these species to have certain traits. Natural selection works in a very similar way, except it's not humans deciding which individuals survive and reproduce. Who's deciding? Nature. Natural dynamics in the ecosystem determine which individuals survive and which don't. For example, this is a very obvious example, one we use a lot. Okay, if we have some mice. Now, are all mice have the exact same fur color? No, there's some natural, we would call it variation. Some are maybe a little bit lighter, some are darker, some have, speckles in them, some don't. So there's variety there. Just natural variation. Well, if a predator is there, and the background where these mice live, their habitat is dark in color, what do you think is going to happen? Maddie?
Will we be able to see the lighter ones more?
Yeah, that the lighter ones are more obvious to the predators. And so what's going to happen? They're more likely to be preyed upon. And if they get preyed upon, that means what can't they do? Reproduce. And therefore, they can't pass on their light-colored genes to the next generation. And so over a period of time, many generations, what would you expect to happen to the overall coloration of these types of mice? You get darker. Okay? Until maybe eventually all mice of the species were darker in color. So the idea behind natural selection is that the living organisms that have the best adaptations, the best characteristics, will survive, will be more likely to survive, and then more likely to reproduce. Any organism that's not well adapted, probably not going to survive, and not likely to reproduce. And we repeat this process generation after generation. What we find is that a species can actually change over time. So this process is called natural selection. So evolution tells us species change over time. Natural selection is an explanation for how does that happen? How do species change? There's a term for it that's often used. You may have heard. Survival of the fittest. You heard that term?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be fit? Not like physically fit, like me, but like fit in another way. So funny.
Oh yeah, I got it.
So what does it mean to be fit in terms of evolution? Devin?
You fit right into your environment.
Maybe.
Adaptable?
I would maybe not use maybe a different word. Caitlin?
You're like stable and like safe.
Yeah, sometimes, but not always so good.
Almost like camouflage. You can run
It could be camouflage an example of being fit, but I'm trying to find another way to sort of say it.
I forgot it. But basically, it was like to be ready.
Sort of. Sort of to be ready, to be well suited to whatever conditions there are in your environment. Okay? And individuals that have the best, are best suited, best adapted to their environment, survive, reproduce, and they pass on these helpful traits to the next generation. Any individuals not well adapted are not going to survive. Over time, what happens is that any beneficial, helpful trait tends to become more and more common in a population, and that leads to evolution. Evolution is why we have such a wide range of different types of living organisms on Earth. Caleb?
What about guinea pigs?
What do you mean? What about it?
Like, where do they come from?
Guinea pigs? I don't know. I don't know the origin of guinea pigs. I mean, they're rodents, like other rodents. I don't know that they are. They probably evolved from like groundhog kind of things and gophers, probably in that group. I don't know if they were.
Came from like
selectively bred by humans to be that way? I would guess in some ways they have. I'm not exactly sure. No, because those two organisms couldn't mate. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't exactly know the evolutionary history of that, but that's something I'll check out. So let's talk about how Darwin proposed natural selection. So first off, in order for natural selection to work, you must have variation in a population. So if you go to the cafeteria at lunch and you look around the other 7th graders, is there a lot of variation in characteristics that you might have? Yeah, there's huge variation in terms of all sorts of different factors. How our body works, and our height, our size, the shape of our hands, and all sorts of factors. There's a huge variation. Now, we are very in tune to it in humans. How about the squirrels in your backyard? Do they have any variation? So they actually do. We, though, because we are not squirrels, we're not really attuned to that. We see a squirrel, we say, yeah, they all kind of look the same. They're the same basic color, shape. They're all the same. But really, squirrels would be just as different from each other as we are from each other. But we don't sort of notice those things because they're different species. All organisms have natural variation in many, many different characteristics, whether it's things that are obvious like fur color, fur patterns, sizes, different chemicals that their body uses. So there's huge variation. And that's what you need for natural selection. Every individual is unique. Here's some bears, some grizzlies. Do you see any variation there? In terms of what? Yeah, fur color, obviously there's a lot of variation. How about these beetles, these ladybug beetles? Any variation?
Different amount of spots.
Yeah, number of spots, color, some are lighter, some are darker. They're all the same species, but there's just natural variation. So that's how you start with evolution. You start with variations, differences. Do you have a question, Jack?
What about red pandas? I know that I've heard that they have their own like family, like not in rodents or mammals, like they're in their own
Group, yeah. Scientists have sort of worked out for all sorts of different species sort of where they fit in terms of evolution. And they used to do that by just differences in how they look. Today they put them in different groups and categories according to their genetics. We'll be talking about that in our next section, next unit. Danielle?
They don't really said like dinosaurs evolved into not whales, birds.
Yes?
What evolved into dinosaurs?
Other reptiles. Dinosaurs are reptiles, a type of reptile that evolved over time.
How did they get so
So you could trace it, you could keep going back for millions of years asking these same questions. But we're going to move on for right now. So we start with variation. And in nature, there is always a struggle for survival. Okay? There's competition. So the natural world, it's a dangerous place. Things are trying to eat you. You have to compete to get a limited amount of food, to find mates, to protect your offspring. There's all sorts of, bless you, all sorts of limitations in nature. Okay? And not every single organism that's born is going to survive. Some fish produce hundreds of thousands of eggs in at one time. Do they all make it into adult fish? No, only a small percentage. Some of them are eaten, some of them just wash away, some are fertilized, sometimes the young are eaten. So only a very small number actually make it into adulthood. Which ones make it? So let's be careful, because I heard some people say strongest. So it's not always the strongest, but it is always, what do you guys say? The fittest. Because sometimes it's good to be small and hidden and fast versus being big and strong. So it depends on the situation. Sometimes it's good for an organ to be brightly colored and stand out. Other times it's beneficial to be camouflaged and hidden. So there's lots of different situations in which certain characteristics are favored. But they don't all survive. The ones that do are those that happen to be lucky and be born with the best characteristics, the best traits. And it's nature that decides who survives and who doesn't. That's why it's natural selection. Nature decides which individuals survive and which don't. So we have variation within the population. There's a struggle for survival with only the best adapted being able to survive. And then there's reproduction and the passing of traits to the next generation. Because an individual can only pass on its genes if it can survive into adulthood. So any helpful, beneficial trait gets passed on in the next generation. There's a frog laying hundreds and hundreds of eggs developing into tadpoles. So if an individual has helpful traits that it was born with, there's a chance it will pass those to the next generation. And then they will be better able to survive and reproduce. And then those beneficial traits will be passed to the next generation. And so over time, hundreds, thousands, millions of years, organisms can adapt to their environment. Species can adapt, I should say. So if we imagine a turtle. A turtle has many adaptations, traits that help it to be successful at surviving and reproducing. Like what? Michelle, how's that a helpful adaptation for turtles, Jake?
Crocodiles actually eat turtles and like the shell.
Okay, it can be protective. It's protective against predators. So turtles that happen to have that shell were favored, survived better, passed on those genes to the next generation. That's an adaptation. And as we follow this logic generation after generation, eventually an adaptation can be present in the entire population. And those changes can eventually even result in a new species being formed. If one group of an organism is evolving in one way, while another group of that same species is evolving a different way, they can become so different from each other that they actually become different species. So when I talked about one group of dinosaurs evolved into birds, they took one pathway, while other groups of reptiles took a different pathway and then diversified. So again, another example. What are some variations we see in this illustration? There's several variations. Give me one. What?
The color of the bugs.
Yeah, the color. That's one difference. You got another one, Will?
I was going to say the color of the shell or the eyes.
The color of the eyes, color of the shell. Okay. Maya?
The size of the dog.
The size is also different. Yeah, those are all a variety of variations. What do you think their competition is in this example? Sophia?
The lizard.
What about it?
The lizard looks like it's gonna eat the beetles.
Yeah, they might have this predator, chameleon, that's going to eat them. Which ones do you think have an advantage in this situation? Olivia?
The bigger ones?
The bigger ones? Could be. What might another possible answer be? Emma? The ones that match the leaf? Yeah, could be. And so over time, if these are natural variations in these beetles, what's going to happen to this whole species over time if we give hundreds of generations? Jake?
Well, say like green beetles survive, then
Yeah, and if they get eaten earlier, they probably won't be able to what?
Have an offspring.
Have offspring, and probably there's going to be fewer in the next generation born with that darker coloration. And over time, that would lead to the entire population evolving to be light green. So we summarize this sort of idea of natural selection with the phrase survival of the fittest. What Darwin says, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but rather the ones most adaptable to change, the ones that have greater variation. So it means the organisms that are most successful in the ecosystem survive and have offspring, and those offspring will resemble the parents.
Oh, wait.
Any questions up to this point? All right, I'm going to pause here in our notes. I guess we're not going to finish. We'll finish maybe tomorrow. But I want to show you this next video I like a lot. It's because it's interesting. A lot of people like dogs and things like that. So this is a little section. Anyone ever watch Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson? So, you seen this segment? This is about the evolution of dogs, which happened not through natural selection, but through, what do we call it? Artificial selection. So this is kind of interesting. So I'll show you this, and then I'll give you your homework once we're done.